With the arrival of a flood of immigrants into a new community that was trying to find itself, you can imagine there must have been some very significant developments and changes in the Jewish religion. And that's exactly what happened in America in the last part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. So what was the issue in America? How come we had such a ferment of religious ideas? Well, the first thing that one ought to note is that we were the only country with a First Amendment that guaranteed separation of church and state. There is no other country, even today, that has such a thing, really. And there are two clauses in this amendment, sometimes in conflict with each other. First, there is the Establishment Clause, which says that no state religion could be established and that would impede the development of other religions. The second is the Free Exercise Clause, which says that people have a right with minimal restraint to religious practice of their own choice. There were no thought or institutional limits in America. And so you have, on the one hand, something that encourages widespread deviation and difference, and on the other hand, that says the government can't stop it. The economic developments of this country also trumped all other desires. Some wanted, of course, to enshrine in law the idea that this was a Christian nation. And there were attempts over and over and over again to do that. The prohibition laws of the 1920s were, in effect, an establishment of a Christian mentality. But the majority were willing to accept diversity in favor of other goals. And the other goals were primarily freedom and economic opportunity. Now, this ferment was not just in Jewish circles. It covered the bases. It was in all groups. And even something as hierarchical and as unified as the Catholic Church was going through something like this. But we spawned a brand new kind of religion in the South, especially called Methodists, from South Carolina and Georgia and out into the Tennessee Valley. You have Amish people. You have various kinds of other Protestants arriving. You have Mormons or Latter-day Saints. And in the 1810s, and then again in the later part of the early before the Civil War, you have great awakenings where there was a ferment of Protestant evangelism and fundamentalism, camp meetings, all kinds of attempts to stir up religious devotion. Enlightenment ideas, on the other hand, encourage the development of something which we will call secularism. Deism, perhaps, but certainly the idea that you could be an American without a religion, and you were perfectly acceptable. And there was no bar to this in America, whereas in other countries, you really couldn't be an out-and-out secularist. In the Jewish community, there were some special factors. First of all, there had never been an Orthodox establishment. There was no power structure like the chief rabbinate and no linkage to the state that prohibited other groups from establishing themselves. Second thing is that the immigration, especially the immigration before 1882, was self-selected. These were people who fled Europe, who left Europe, not because of persecution or poverty, but because they wanted new opportunities and new freedoms. And the people who were traditional in their practice or in their mentality stayed in Europe. Another factor was that there was a lack of infrastructure or support. There were relatively few institutions in America to encourage religious affiliation or conformity. So you had a variety of institutions growing up, sometimes new ones, sometimes modeled after European immigration and European models, and sometimes brand new. The immigrants were also forced to make compromises in order to make a living. They had to work on Saturday. That's the Sabbath. And that was something that they didn't have to do or couldn't do in Europe. And finally, there was the intoxicating nature of freedom. This was something remarkably new for Jews, and they wanted to take full advantage of it. So the Jewish community was in turmoil in the 19th century about what kind of religious behaviors and thought would be appropriate to the American scene. And of course, obviously, different groups of Jews were going to differ with each other. So let's look at the main groups. The first is the group called Reform Judaism. It had begun in Germany in 1810 as an attempt to modernize, to be more like their neighbors. They had an organ in their services, instrumental music was permitted, mixed seating of men and women, confirmation instead of bar mitzvah. The sermon was given in the vernacular, in most cases in German, and there was a sense of decorum. People prayed in unison, and they sat and stood when they were supposed to, and not on their own schedule. There was limited progress of Reform Judaism or Liberal Judaism in Central Europe, largely because it was blocked by the traditional forces. The power of the establishment was considerable, and sometimes they appealed to the police, as they did once in Hamburg, Germany. Change was not easy, and they had a long way to go in Europe. In America, where there were no traditions and no establishment, it was an open field for innovation. Reform Judaism was based on the study of languages, of texts, and historical development over time. They concluded, scholars of Reform Judaism concluded, that the Torah had not been written at one single moment at the top of Mount Sinai. That was, of course, the claim of the Orthodox. But they began to believe that the Torah had been compiled over centuries and that its final form did not occur until sometime after the Babylonian exile, which means around the year 500 or even 450 before the Common Era. The Torah reflects, they concluded, many different situations. Some of the laws were for shepherds and Bedouins. Some of the laws were for farmers. Settled agriculture was a later development. And some of the laws were for urban situations, which was an even later development. They found conflicting statements in the text. Now, Orthodox scholars were very capable of figuring out how to explain what looks like a contradiction and is really not a contradiction, they say. But from a literary point of view, these contradictions and confusions belie a single perfect author. For example, there are two stories of creation in Genesis 1 and then again in Genesis 2. When does Eve appear? And so on. You have two versions of the fifth commandment in the list of 10 commandments in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. Different wording. You have the last part of the 34th chapter of Deuteronomy, which appears to be written after Moses dies. All of this suggests to scholars that the Torah is somewhat of a human document responding to divine inspiration, but nevertheless not all revealed at the same time. The conclusion is that this document is the result of perhaps 8 centuries of Jewish religious development in the land of Israel, and that there is clearly a combination of human and perhaps divine input. If humans wrote what they believed God wanted them to do, then later humans could do the same thing. And they came up with the notion of continuing revelation, that they could continue to understand the will of God and write it down and follow it. And what was true in desert situations several thousand years ago might not be true in St. Louis, Missouri, or in New York City, or in Mobile, Alabama. Humans could make choices as their circumstances changed. So they found inspiration not from a single source, not from a unitary author, but from many events, from many people, from much experience, and from thinking of people over a great deal of time. Now, this religious philosophy was superbly tailored to the American environment, where it was virtually impossible to be Jewish in the European Orthodox mode. What was necessary in America was adaptability and change. Development was the key to Jewish survival as a religious community in America. And this is all, of course, also part of what makes an American of a non-Jewish persuasion. But they also wanted to maintain some traditions, especially the ethical and the moral values that they found in the classic texts. So they found a way to be firmly Jewish, but also to be somewhat different from their neighbors. And that way is called Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism spread rapidly during the 19th century. In fact, one might be justified in saying that it was, during that century, American Judaism. It was especially popular outside major metropolitan areas in the South, the Southwest, the Midwest, and the Far West. In 1873, our friend Isaac Mayer Wise created the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which meant that congregations of like mind could support each other and communicate with each other and form a seminary where they could train leadership, which they did 2 years later with the Hebrew Union College. At first, leadership had to depend on German universities and seminaries. But in 1875, we have Hebrew Union College, and in 1883, the first class of 4 graduates are ordained, the first American rabbis trained in America for America. That begins a new chapter. And today, Reform Judaism is the largest of all the religious groups among American Jews. Reform Judaism went through a period of resistance to tradition. We are not them and we will not be like them, they said. We will rebel against that group. And in a sense, it's like a teenager who says, I don't want to be like my parent. As Reform Judaism matured over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century, it became more comfortable with tradition, with identity, and with being an American Jew. So there was less struggle. And tradition is no longer something to be avoided, but something actively to be sought. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have Orthodox Judaism. Orthodoxy is a term of comparison. Before Reform Judaism arrives, you can only have Judaism. There's nothing Orthodox or Reform. It is based on a simple proposition that the Torah comes from a single authoritative source, a lawgiver on Sinai who expects to be obeyed. And everything else that derives from the Torah, all the medieval documents, have that authority built into them. It has been transmitted from Sinai without error and without change. And if it appears to humans that it is incoherent or even wrong, well, then you have to explain it and make sure that everybody understands that the problem is only in appearances. It's not really a problem. To help do this, they had a second idea, and that's the oral Torah, a revelation that was also given at Sinai, but only copied down later. The oral Torah is found in the Mishnah and in the Babylonian Talmud, and sometimes it's expanded to include Midrash and other documents. Anything that is coherent with the document of Sinai is oral Torah. It includes interpretations, it includes expansions, it includes explanations, it includes updating to new circumstances, application of things that were true in the desert to things that are not true now that we live in medieval Europe, and so on. But it brooks no deviation. God is God, and God expects to be obeyed. This is mandatory, and that's the difference. A human document in the form of the Torah as Reformed Jews got it was still human, and humans can be fallible, but not in Orthodoxy. There were some efforts in America after the immigration from Central Europe in the 1840s and 50s. Some German and Polish Jews came, but it was difficult because of the lack of institutional infrastructure. There was limited opportunity to observe kosher food laws. Few butchers, few bakers. There were few mikvahs, ritual baths. There was no leadership. The Tree of Life Seminary, Eitz Chaim Seminary, was the first effort by American Orthodox Jews to train indigenous leadership, and that comes from 1886. It became the Rabbi Elchanan Theological Seminary in 1896, 10 years later, and is now part of Yeshiva University. And it was an attempt to harmonize traditional belief and practice with modern university studies, and so we would call this today modern Orthodoxy. A major forward movement occurred after Jews began to flee Eastern Europe, both before World War I and even after World War II, those who survived. Previously, traditionalists could stay in Europe in relative safety. But after 1882 and the pogroms in Russia, there was really no option. They had to leave. And so the growth of primarily major centers of Orthodox population in large American cities occurred. They needed to sustain institutions, and so they brought those institutions with them. And over time, there was a split between the modern Orthodox and the Hasidic Orthodox, who are even more traditional, and especially after World War II, as refugees. Hasidim are ultra-Orthodox. They come from the model of the Baal Shem Tov, who was really named Israel ben Eliezer, who lived in about 1750. And they derive from dynasties, that is, groups of Jews allied with a particular rabbi and Rebbe, as he is called, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Romania, and elsewhere. And there may be as many as 50 or 60 groups of Hasidic Jews in the world today. They follow one Rebbe, and he gives them advice, which is more than advice, it's really life counseling. They're more or less insular. Some do more outreach, like the Chabad Lubavitch group, and some stay as much as possible to themselves. Hasidic groups are growing rapidly because they encourage the development of very large families. We'll go into that more later. The third group in American Judaism is called Conservative Judaism. Conservative Judaism is a theory that was propounded by a rabbi named Zacharias Frankel, a Hungarian of the late 19th century. He called it historical positive Judaism. In other words, it looked at the history of Judaism, but wherever it was possible to be positive to tradition, that was the choice that was made. Modern studies have laid the basis for adaptation and change and choice. But history requires choices to be made according to the tradition wherever possible. This movement also did not find much solid footing in Europe, but the US was congenial. There was a large group of traditionally minded immigrants who had come over from Eastern Europe around the early 20th century. They could not, of course, observe all the stringencies of orthodoxy because of their need to survive in this environment. Compromise was necessary, but they wanted very much to have a Sabbath service and practice that had a traditional feel. And so they functioned well under the specific circumstances of America with a traditional bent. The person most responsible for the growth of conservative Judaism in America was Rabbi Solomon Schechter. Schechter had been born in Romania as the son of a Hasidic family. He had a traditional yeshiva or Orthodox education, and then in 1879 he attended in Berlin the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, the High Academy for the Scientific Study of Judaism. He remained traditional in his own personal practice, but he acknowledged that Judaism had changed in the past and would continue to do so to meet new and changing circumstances and conditions. In the fall of 1896, two Scottish women met with Schechter, and they showed him some manuscripts that they had brought back from Cairo, Egypt. He recognized that these manuscripts were very old, and they told him that they came from a synagogue in a suburb of Cairo called the Ben Ezra Synagogue. Schechter was very impressed and motivated. And so in December of 1896, he went to Cairo and he found the Geniza, the storehouse of thousands and thousands of ancient documents dating back perhaps 1,000 years. And he brought back a large number of these documents to Cambridge, where he was a scholar at the university. Now, many of these documents had been stuck together by the pressure of time and heat and humidity, and so it was a laborious task to separate them and then to find out what they were. Some were secular documents, letters between people, contracts for various businesses, things like that, deeds of property. Some were ritual documents, ketubot, wedding contracts, and things like divorce documents. And then some were parts of biblical books. he found a hitherto unknown manuscript of a scholar named Ben Sirach, who was the author of the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, also known often as Ecclesiasticus. And so this had previously only been known in Latin and Greek. Now he had something brand new. He developed his entire reputation based on the study of these documents. In 1900, 4 years later, a delegation of American Jews prevailed on Schechter to become the president of the new Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which became the headquarters of the conservative movement. So what do we have? We have an American Jewish community which is becoming very varied and differentiated among different groups. Different people are going to react to this new environment of America in different ways. And yet, on the other hand, America is also becoming Jewishly homogeneous, because as immigration begins to tail off after 1924, people are subject to the same social influences. There's no more large-scale immigration, and there is little membership split. So essentially, what we have are some who are basically reform or liberal, and some who are traditional, and the conservative movement has begun to decline because their members are either choosing to be more or less Orthodox or move over to the liberal side. And it is no longer as necessary as before. So America, in summary, has been a laboratory of religious change for American Jews. And we see that there are new movements arriving almost all the time. And even today, we have new movements within American Judaism.